Before there was Ellen Ripley. Before there was Wonder Woman. There was the original action heroine, Atalanta. Now available in ebook, paperback, and audio form. Links in the description. The year is 5 ABY, 1 year following the Battle of Endor and the death of Emperor Palpatine. Lors Geptun, an information broker who, during the Clone Wars and the Galactic Civil War, switched sides more often than you've had hot dinners, is called in to a meeting with Luke Skywalker, General of the Rebel Alliance and the last of the Jedi Knights. Or the first of the new, depending on who you ask. Anyway, this great hero of the rebellion, defeater of both Palpatine and Vader, paragon of virtue, has a job for Geptun. He wants the information broker to investigate and indict a war criminal. Geptun asks, "Who is this war criminal?" And Luke Skywalker replies, "Myself." Not gonna lie, when I first read that, I literally had to put the book down and say, wow, that's one hell of an opening stinger. This is Luke Skywalker and the Shadows of Mindor. As ever, first the backstory. Shadows of Mindor was written in December of 2008 by Matthew Stover. He's written a few books of his own, namely the Acts of Cain, which I highly recommend, and the Bara the Pict series, which I can't simply because I haven't read them yet, but he is still mostly well known for his contributions to Star Wars, including one entry in the New Jedi Order series, the Clone Wars novel Shatterpoint, a novelization of Revenge of the Sith, and The Shadows of Mindor. In his own words, Stover said that Luke Skywalker and The Shadows of Mindor is my attempt to get the EU back to its pre-Zahn roots, specifically to invoke memories of my all-time favorite Star Wars books, Brian Daley's Han Solo novels. There's not much else to say in terms of the background of this book, but it is interesting that this quote highlights just how much the renaissance of the expanded universe, made possible by Timothy Zahn's Thrawn trilogy and Dark Horse's production of Dark Empire, really did impact Star Wars material beyond the films. Hell, until recently, I actually thought that the expanded universe began with the Thrawn trilogy and Dark Empire, until some longtime fans made sure to inform me of my mistake in the comments section of some videos. And it certainly is interesting that Stover would deliberately design this book as a throwback to the older Star Wars media. At any rate, let's begin. It's been a year since the Battle of Endor, and Luke Skywalker is increasingly having doubts about his continuing to have an official role in both the Rebellion and its new incarnation, the New Republic. Specifically, a military role. Obviously, due to his status as a hero of the Rebellion, the New Republic leadership really wants to keep him on, both for PR and for the obvious military advantage of his Jedi insight. Eventually, mostly after some persuasion from Leia and Han, Luke reluctantly allows the New Republic to make him a general and put him in charge of a brand new military unit the New Republic has cooked up, the Rapid Response Task Force. Its purpose is perhaps best summed up by Wedge Antilles. Hit him with our big stick, slap him good, and run like hell. Even though he's accepted this, Luke's still not happy with the idea, if only because he feels that his new subordinates don't question him enough, which uncomfortably borders on sycophancy, or hero worship, something that's not exactly very useful in a battle. It also doesn't help that people have started making really cheesy and horrendously inaccurate film adaptations of the events of the Rebellion. One egregious example has a fight aboard the Death Star 2 with Luke trying to avenge Palpatine by killing Vader. And the RRTF is going to need all of its wits because their first assignment is to deal with a particularly troublesome group of the Imperial Remnant, who have rallied around a man with the somewhat dramatic-sounding name of Lord Shadowspawn. At the moment, the bastard is holed up on a planet in the Taskband system called Mindor. It's situated in the Inner Rim and is protected from invasion, for the most part, by an unstable asteroid field that was created when some Imperial gravtech experiment went wrong, known as the Big Crush. It literally turned a planetary-sized body into a field of meteorites surrounding the world, making it very, very difficult to approach. Initially, though, when the RRTF arrives just beyond the asteroids, led by Luke Skywalker aboard the Mon Calamari vessel Justice, things seem to go the New Republic's way. The initial TIE fighter attack is seen off by the starfighters carried aboard the Mon Cal cruiser, and then Shadowspawn sends an unarmed vessel with an offer of surrender. Of course, you don't need to be a Jedi to see a trap that obvious, but unfortunately Luke doesn't identify the nature of the trap until it's too late. That unarmed, unmanned shuttle contains a gravity bomb, and it manages to get close enough to the Justice that when it detonates, it tears the Star Cruiser into 3 pieces. For the sake of context, a Mon Cal Star Cruiser ranges from 4,000 to 5,000 feet in length, and usually carries a crew of just under 5,500 servicemen. Some of the bridge crew managed to survive, but given that the bridge section of Justice is hurtling towards the surface of Mindor with only attitude thrusters intact, you really would need a Jedi to get out of that alive. Just as well that Luke Skywalker was on the bridge when this happened. But of course, the fun doesn't stop there. While the rest of the task force is reeling from the Justice's destruction, Shadowspawn sets off other gravity mines hidden in the asteroid field between the fleet and Mindor, followed up by waves upon waves of TIE interceptors and TIE defenders. The New Republic forces are just too busy trying to save their own skins to worry about anything else. And when they hear reports of Justice's destruction, they assume that Skywalker is dead along with the rest. Funnily enough, Shadowspawn seems to be the only one with any faith in Luke's abilities, because when he receives a similar report from his own subordinates, he figures that the only person who could possibly land the bridge section with only the attitude thrusters on Mindor in any way intact would have to be Skywalker. And for mysterious reasons yet to be elucidated, Shadowspawn is very, very keen to take Luke alive. While all this has been going on, Han, Leia, and 3PO are in the middle of incredibly frustrating negotiations. Basically, there's this planet that was abandoned by the Empire, voted almost unanimously to join the New Republic, but there's a group of Mandalorian mercenaries that were working for the Empire who were given as their final orders to deny the planet to the rebels at all costs, and are parked next to what are essentially futuristic nuclear power plants that they can blow up if they feel they must. The talks are going nowhere, and suddenly Leia gets a sense through the Force that Luke is in trouble. What follows next is, I don't know if comedy of errors is the right way to phrase it, but that's certainly how it feels like it to me. Leia gets this feeling in the Force, tells Han about it. Han goes to find out what's going on. Right about the time that the New Republic receives the first communiques of the mess that's going on at Mindor, Han decides unilaterally to take Chewbacca and the Millennium Falcon off to Mindor to help Luke without telling Leia first. Leia finds out about this, gets pissed off, and decides to go after him, completely abandoning the negotiations and bullying Rogue Squadron, including Wedge Antilles and Tycho Selchu, to go with her. And then, shortly after they leave, Lando Calrissian arrives. Earlier in the negotiations, Leia had sent him to Mandalore in order to bring over Fen Shaisa, leader of the Mandalorian Protectors, and at this point in the Star Wars timeline, though admittedly the continuity is a little wobbly here, the Mandalore of all Mandalorians. You might recall him if you've seen any of my streams from December 2023 where I rambled on about the first Marvel Star Wars comic. Unfortunately, even the authority of the new Mandalore isn't enough to make the mercenaries budge. Then Lando finds out where Han and Leia have gone and manages to conclude the negotiations by basically telling the mercs that they've won. They get to keep the planet and stay where they are. Except, since the Empire's gone and isn't likely to come back for them, they're also unlikely to pay them. And wouldn't you know it, Lando's decided that he's willing to hire these mercenaries to fight for the New Republic and more specifically help clear up the mess in Mindor. And just like that, the mercenary leader agrees on the condition that they get paid up front first. Meanwhile, Luke, R2-D2, and the remaining survivors of the Justice's crew are trying to basically not die amidst the volcanic hellscape of Mindor. Originally a pleasant vacation planet, until the big crush happened and the planet was subjected to intense meteoric bombardment. Even though the worst of the meteor showers have long since passed, the impacts have thrown up so much metallic dust in the air, apparently the soil of Mindor is rich in metals, that the very air is difficult to breathe long term, and all those metal particulates make long-distance communication all but impossible. Then, just to put the cherry on top, shortly after they try to make shelter in a cave, the crew of the Justice, apart from R2 and Luke, essentially disappear, seemingly swallowed up by the Earth, or at least some mysterious people beneath the Earth. Hold on to that thought, it comes up later. Luke despairs initially, having seemingly led a bunch of innocent people to their deaths, but this is post-Endor Luke, so he doesn't exactly go into blue screen of death mode for too long. A quick mental kick in the pants, and he achieves some Jedi Zen, and comes to the realization that rather than agonize over what he can't change, focus on what he can. And so, when the Empire find him, he hides R2 and says, quite literally to his captors, quote, "If it's not too much of a cliché, take me to your leader. If it is too much of a cliché, take me anyway." And the Imperials do indeed take him to their leader. And what follows at first plays out almost like those cheesy holodramas Luke has come to despise so much. Shadow Spawn hams it up really badly, and then challenges Luke to a sword fight, saying that if Luke can kill him, his men will serve him. Odd condition. Of course Luke wins, but from the beginning he can tell that this whole thing is more like a stage performance than an actual fight. What's more, by now Luke thinks he knows Shadow Spawn's true identity. Black Hole, an Imperial agent during the Rebellion period that briefly featured in a Star Wars newspaper comic strip back in the late 70s. And so because of that, and in part because Luke doesn't like killing if he doesn't have to, he instead knocks out Shadow Spawn with a well-aimed punch to the forehead, which puts a big crack in this weird crescent moon-shaped helmet he's wearing. Luke removes the helmet, too late to realize that it's actually grafted to the man's skull, so it comes away with more than a little blood, and he realizes that the man he's been fighting isn't really Shadow Spawn, technically. For the identity of Shadow Spawn itself is a facade, employed by Black Hole. The man whose ass he's just kicked is in fact one Nick Rostu, a man with minor force sensitivity. And here we learn something pretty creepy about how Black Hole has been doing his operations here. Besides the regular troopers and even some clones from the Clone Wars, Black Hole has a sort of elite caste called the Pawns. And in fact, during the fight, Luke realizes that the name Shadow Spawn doesn't refer to a spawn of shadows, but Shadow's pawn. And it turns out the meaning of that name is all too literal. You see, Mindor has this rather unique substance, because of course it does, called Melt Massif. And somehow, it's revealed later how, Black Hole has found a way to essentially make Melt Massif psychokinetic, in that it can respond to his force commands. To help enforce his will, he kidnaps minor force sensitives from various planets. He then has the tops of their skulls removed and starts fiddling around with their brains. Whenever he's isolated an exact nerve bundle and figures out exactly what that nerve bundle does, oh, this causes crying, this one triggers sight, this one triggers smell, this one makes you laugh, etc., he has tiny thin crystals of Melt Massif inserted into their brains. Over time, the Melt Massif, which is a kind of semi-living substance, grows into a network inside the victim's body and mind. And it is through this network that Black Hole uses the Force to control his pawns like pawns. Of course, since Luke didn't kill Rostu/Shadow Spawn like he was supposed to, the real Black Hole has them both knocked out for going off script. Admittedly, when I first read this, I was kind of disappointed because I felt that a great twist had been revealed too early. But to his credit, Stover does make up for it by then going into some really interesting detail with the backstory of black hole, real name Chronal. Chronal is a human force sensitive, and long ago when he was a wee boy, he was kidnapped by these very weird near-human aliens from the unknown regions called the Sorcerers of Rhand. The Rhandists are force users of a kind, but they reject the light side, dark side dichotomy of the Jedi and the Sith. They are, to put it bluntly, an extremely nihilistic death cult. They believe that the light side and the dark side are but illusions. There is only one cosmic force in the universe, and they call it simply the dark. And the dark is not so much evil as it is pure destruction. And it works upon the universe through the impulse of living beings to destroy or cause harm of any kind to those around them. The ultimate goal of the dark, so the Rhandists believe, is to destroy all that is in the universe, to restore the universe to nothing. And they believe that it is their job, indeed the job of all sentient life, even if they don't know it, to further that destruction. They literally believe that the end of all things is the will of the universe. After his upbringing among the Rhandists, Chronal decided to go to the Empire and work for Palpatine in the hopes that maybe he could find ways of furthering the Dark's cause there. In fact, Chronal gives an interesting reason as to why he thinks Palpatine was so successful initially during the Clone Wars era, and why it started to all go downhill for him repeatedly during the Rebellion. When he was working to destroy the Republic or the Jedi Order, or just his enemies in general, Palpatine was serving the Dark, and thus he succeeded, because the Dark, again, desires destruction. Once he became Emperor, though, and turned the Old Republic into the Galactic Empire, he stopped doing that. Indeed, he kept trying to maintain and preserve this new empire of his. And of course, preservation is antithetical to what the Dark wants, and so the Dark turned its back on him. Thus, from the very beginning, Chronal knew that this Galactic Empire thing was just doomed to failure. And so, while pretending to have a rivalry with Vader, he managed to subtly manipulate Palpatine into putting him at a very distant posting on the edge of the Empire, so that Chronal was away from all the chaos and destruction that resulted from the Empire's collapse following the Battle of Endor. Now he's back, and he's got a plan that he thinks will best allow him to bring about the annihilation of all that is, as the Dark would will it. He plans nothing less than to take over Luke Skywalker's mind. Literally. At this point, Chronal's body is an ancient, enfeebled old man in a life support pod. He can only really act through his servants, and especially through his pawns, since thanks to the Melt Massif, their minds are connected to his. He essentially plans to do to Luke what he did to create his pawns, only in a far more subtle and sophisticated way. Instead of just crudely shoving shards and splinters of crystal into Luke's brain, Chronal plans to insert very, very fine threads of the crystal into Luke through practically the pores in his skin and through his eyes and other orifices, creating a far more sophisticated crystalline neural network, far more advanced than what he's done with his pawns. It's kind of like comparing using a bone saw as opposed to a scalpel. Once this procedure is complete, Chronal plans to essentially switch minds with Luke Skywalker using the Force and the new connection between their minds forged by the Melt Massif. Thus, while wearing the name and face of the last Jedi and the New Republic's greatest hero, he will begin to lead the galaxy on the path to utter annihilation, just as the Dark would want. In fact, it's revealed that Chronal is behind some of those horrendously exaggerated and cheesy holo thrillers that Luke despises so much. Because of course they're the sorts of things that appeal to the credulous masses who will just eat it up and believe it. In fact, he even used one of these holo thrillers called The Jedi's Revenge to convince a lot of his Imperial soldiers to follow him, and that he will one day pass on the leadership to Luke Skywalker, hence that whole thing with Shadow Spawn, kill me and my men will serve you. It's also why Luke was supposed to kill Shadow Spawn according to Chronal's script. Then Luke would get separated, have his mind switched around, and emerge triumphant, with Chronal puppeteering his body so that he could drive the universe toward destruction. In fact, he was even planning to release another holo thriller based around this event. And so in the end, he will be the last thing at the end of the universe, and then he will allow himself to die, achieving nothingness. Odeon from the Knight-Errant series wishes he could be as nihilistic as this guy. Meanwhile, the rest of the gang has managed to make it to Mindor, and the situation is slowly beginning to improve for the New Republic task force. By now, thanks to Shadow Spawn's trap, they are caught between Mindor itself and the asteroid belt, meaning they can't just flee to hyperspace. Luckily, the Imperial forces on Mindor do not include any capital ships of their own, and so the starfighters, including Rogue Squadron and Lando's newly hired Mandalorian mercenaries, can hold off the ties, while the remaining New Republic capital ships use their own gravity well projectors and repulsors to try and forge a path through the asteroid belt so that they can escape to hyperspace. At one point, though, they're forced to abandon that temporarily and take shelter on the dark side of Mindor as several bits of debris from the Big Crush fly into Taspan's sun, causing seriously dangerous solar flares. While 3PO remains with Lando aboard the Corellian frigate Remember Alderaan, Han, Leia, and Chewie go down to Mindor in the Falcon to see if they can find Luke, R2, and the survivors of the Justice. They find R2 and are then promptly found by a group of rebels on Mindor, not as in attached to the Rebellion or the New Republic. Just some locals who aren't really keen on the Empire. Although admittedly they're more interested in trying to maintain their own survival than any idealistic cause. As demonstrated by the fact that they, and specifically their leader, Aona Cantor, managed to steal the Falcon. Something that Han does not take very well. Sure, Leia may be the love of his life and Chewie his best friend in all the universe, but the Falcon is his baby. With only Leia's force connection to Luke as a guide, they try to make their way through the tunnels beneath what turns out to be called Shadow Base, Chronal's little bolt hole fortress, when the very walls and floor of the cave tunnels start coming to life and attacking them. We'll go into them more later, but these guys are basically known as the Melters, and they're essentially living crystalline aliens. What's really relevant here is that they are pretty much immune to any kind of damage our heroes can deal out. Physical assaults and blaster bolts, they just liquefy and reform. They are briefly stymied by R2's little taser thing and stun blasts, but they've only got so much ammo to spare. And as it turns out, the Melters end up driving them into this big chamber full of their previous victims, including the remaining crew of the Justice, who are mostly still alive, but also includes a lot of local Mindor types and some of Black Hole's stormtroopers who've been down there so long they've died. Meanwhile, back above ground, Lando and the rest of the New Republic task force are having to contend with Shadow Base's defenses. After all, they're just on the night side of the planet to hide from the radiation flares coming off of Taspan's sun. But of course the planet's still rotating beneath them, and now they're in range of its weapons. Plus, there's still all those TIE fighters still shooting out of all their little pockets in the asteroid field. It's gotten desperate to the point where they've had to send down Republic Marines and Fen Shice's Mandalorians to engage with some of the Imperials hand-to-hand. Meanwhile, the capital ships focus all their firepower on Shadow Base's main defenses: 4 pairs of ion cannons, and a single giant gravity gun built using the same technology that caused the Big Crush. If that thing fires, pretty much the whole task force will be compacted into scrap metal, and then torn apart again. So the capital ships maintain fire to keep the Imperial gunners' heads down and the weapons safely ensconced. But this can only last for so long. Everybody's working on a deadline here, including Chronal. After recapturing Luke and Nick Rostu, he has the Jedi encased in a block of melt massif, thanks to his influence over the Melters. Again, that's something we'll come to again later. Then, establishing this other, very fine crystal network within Luke's mind, he tries to crush the Jedi's mental defenses so that he can just slip into his body and puppeteer him. And he does this by basically the full-on nihilist assault. He cuts off all of Luke's senses, including of time, so he has no idea what or when or where he is. So he feels like he's experiencing the dark and all of its terrible futility for what essentially seems like a small eternity. Essentially, he just repeats the message over and over that everything is futile, that it's all going to end. Why fight me, boy? And he comes darn close to succeeding. But as he struggles against the crushing nihilism, Luke realizes something. That Kronol's connection to his mind via the weird crystal neural network of the Melt Massif is a two-way street. More than two-way, in fact, as since Kronol is connected to all of his pawns, including the recaptured and re-brainwashed Nick Rostu, so is Luke. And it seems that Kronol never took into account the damage Luke inflicted to the mind control crescent helmet on Rostu's head, meaning that the Rhandist's power over Nick is weaker than the other pawns. And because this is post-Endor Luke ultimately self-sacrificing, he decides to focus his connection through the Force not on saving himself, but on saving Nick. If Nick does in fact get free and decide to free him, all well and good. If not, at least Luke will have saved someone from Black Hole's insanity this day. And it works. With a little mental nudge from Luke, Nick is able to free himself from Kronol's control and manages to save the Jedi. There's this bit where he's briefly tempted to take the easy way and just kill all the other pawns to get to Luke. But thanks to that brief mental connection, he already kind of understands Luke's nature and knows that Skywalker would never really appreciate a bunch of innocent victims of Kronol's brainwashing getting killed just to save his life. And maybe it's because they briefly shared a mind and soul, for lack of a better term, but Nick, normally something of a combat pragmatist, can't quite bring himself to disappoint Luke Skywalker. It's almost like the mental equivalent of the puppy dog treatment. In the end, though, even after Luke is freed, the only way to stop the pawns is to take out the crescent helmets on their heads. And unfortunately, Kronol built dead man switches into all of them so that when the helmets are disabled, the pawns are all killed. The only reason that Nick is still alive is because when Luke punched him in the head when he was play acting as Shadow Spawn, it damaged the helmet just the right way so that the dead man switch was disabled. So yeah, Luke's not exactly happy about this. But right now, he's got more important things to worry about, namely the fact that he can sense Leia's presence and knows that she's in deadly danger. Besides the obvious fact that a monstrous being like Kronol just has to be stopped. Luckily, thanks to those weird holodramas that Kronol was using to manipulate some of the Imperials, including the clone troopers especially, and thanks to that whole Shadow Spawn spiel that if Luke won, his forces would obey him, Luke is actually able to take command of the Imperial forces that he encounters. And when he discovers massive slave pens full of prisoners in the depths of Shadow Base, he's able to force the stormtroopers to actually care and provide for the civilians until they can find some way to evacuate them. The pair of escapees manage to make their way to the surface of Shadow Base, just as the Millennium Falcon is now in danger of being shot out of the sky, as apparently its new owners aren't really making any distinction between Imperials or New Republic as they hove in on Shadow Base. They end up crashing after all, but Luke is just in time to cushion the fall with the Force. So at least the ship is intact, and most of the people inside survive. It turns out that Aona, leader of the Mindor rebels, quote-unquote, is Nick Rostu's main squeeze, and all of this, including stealing the Falcon from Han, was all to get him back from Kronol. Luckily, thanks to his Jedi insight, Luke knows that they didn't kill his friends to steal the Millennium Falcon, otherwise he would be sore tempted to break his no pointless death policy. Besides, he doesn't have time for petty vengeance even if he were. Even though Nick freed him from Kronol's trap, the Melt Massif is still in him, and so he still has a partial connection to Kronol. And just to make matters worse, Kronol has become aware of Leia's presence. And, unsurprisingly, the old bastard has come to the conclusion that Leia, with no Jedi training and thus no mental defenses, might be an easier meat puppet to claim. So, as if it weren't already, time is very much of the essence. As if that weren't enough, Luke's exposure to the dark has left I guess you could call it a sliver of it in his own soul, as he has to periodically focus to try and drown out the nihilistic whisperings in his ear that all is pointless, that all that matters is power and destruction, that all the virtues and principles that he's been brought up to believe in are but lies to shield oneself from the terrible, crushing pointlessness of existence. So now there is also the danger of him possibly falling under its sway if he isn't careful. Luckily, because Shadow Base is built near a bunch of active volcanoes, the lava rock on which everyone is standing is riddled with caves and tunnels. And so, through use of the Force, the Falcon's engines, and some judicious use of the quad laser batteries, Luke, Rostu, and his allies managed to literally burrow the Falcon underground into the tunnel network. They managed to reach Han and Chewie in time, but not before Cronal manages to kidnap Leia using another meat puppet he's had metaphorically on ice all this time, a former barbarian named Kar Vastor. Both Nick and Kar, by the way, feature in one of Stover's other Star Wars books, the aforementioned Shatterpoint. There's this little amusing scene where Luke kind of forces Aona to apologize to Han for stealing the Falcon, but given that the woman he loves is about to be basically taken as a meat suit by Cronal, Han's probably not as concerned about that as he otherwise would have been. Back on the surface, things seem to be going the New Republic's way for a change, especially once Fen Shaisa and the Republic Marines link up with the stormtroopers that are now pledged to Emperor Skywalker. And of course, that's exactly the moment when Cronal springs his next big trap. Turns out he's got a bunch of giant anti-grav generators built underneath Shadow Base. He activates them, and the whole thing just starts to lift off from the world. Such a big chunk of the planet, in fact, that it actually threatens to tear Mindor apart, leaving the New Republic fleet completely exposed to the radiation storms coming out of Taspan. Lando and the New Republic fleet have no choice but to stay as close to Shadow Base as possible to avoid the radiation, which of course puts them in line of Cronal's weaponry. At least one of the major cruisers is completely obliterated by the gravity gun before Lando hits on a desperate idea. Among the New Republic ships originally sent to Mindor with the task force were a bunch of mid-sized cruiser types called /Vs that have their own gravity projectors. This was supposed to help the New Republic get through the asteroid field to attack Shadow Spawn and Mindor directly. Lando's desperate ploy is that the /Vs use their gravity projectors in conjunction with the repulsors of the bigger capital ships to essentially slingshot the gravity gun's projectiles back at Shadow Base. Now, I know that Star Wars is science fantasy and thus about as soft sci-fi as you can get, but I don't know, for some reason that always felt more than a little off to me. My expertise in Star Wars lore mostly focuses on major historical events and alien races, not so much the technology. If someone in the comments section is more knowledgeable about in-universe tech, then please, I would love to see a comment explaining how this might work, even within the very loose rules of the Star Wars universe. While all this is going on, Luke actually makes use of that melt-massive neural network that Cronal implanted in him to commune with the Melters, the weird flowing rock aliens. It's pretty complicated, but as best as I can describe, the Melters feed off of energy, specifically the radiation from Taspan's star. In fact, they originally lived on that other planet in the Taspan system that was broken up by that gravity experiment gone wrong known as the Big Crush. For most of the Melters, who have no concept of existence beyond their own, this was actually a good thing, as it meant more of them were exposed directly to the radiation. After all, they were part of the rock of that planet, and when it was broken up, that much more of its surface area was exposed. But then, a lot of the asteroids that were containing the Melters landed on Mindor, which, thanks to all that metallic heavy dust that was thrown up by the constant meteoric bombardment, meant that most of the Melters were actually cut off from the sun once they landed on its surface. They were essentially slowly starving to death until Cronal found them and basically coerced them into serving him. The Melters are literally made of melt massive. And by essentially enslaving them, Cronal was able to use them to reshape the rock of Shadow Base and create those neural networks he used to control his pawns. The Melters also doubled as a kind of ad hoc security force. Because the Melters didn't understand the concept of organic life, they didn't really kill any of their victims, they just carried them off to that chamber where they were all stuck in the ground. Of course, they all eventually died, but again, the Melters didn't understand how organic life works, and the concept of organic death is utterly alien to them. Of course, by communing with the Melters, Luke brings himself dangerously close to succumbing to the dark. The way that his mind frames it, Luke and the Melters are like little stars, and Cronal is a massive black hole trying to swallow it all. On the plus side, he also is able to perceive Leia as one of the stars. Bad news, she's dangerously close to the event horizon of Cronal's black hole. The good news is, despite her lack of Jedi training, her mind is actually resisting the Rhandist sorcerer, much to his annoyance. Afterwards, Leia reveals that a good deal of her ability to resist Cronal came from her love of Han, and this does bring me to a significant weak point. In the story, I mean. Among all the various different plots and subplots, one of these is something of the relationship between Han and Leia. Obviously, it's post-Endor, so they're an item even if they haven't married yet. And they do set up something during the initial meeting with the Mandalorian mercenaries where, via Han's internal monologue, we learn that there's a part of him that's deeply insecure about his relationship with Leia. Namely, the fear that he's not good enough for her, and one day she might wake up and realize that mistake. The thing is, Stover never really goes anywhere with this. Apart from near the very end, all the interactions between Han and Leia are mostly the classic belligerent sexual tension a la The Empire Strikes Back. They bicker, they exchange barbs, Leia briefly gets jealous of Aona and actually gives her a black eye. But of course, in the end, they reaffirm their love for each other, having never really addressed Han's insecurity or Leia's side of that particular argument. And it does kind of strike at what is perhaps the big weakness of Luke Skywalker and the Shadows of Mindor. I think Stover tried to stuff too much into a single book. Another example is his trying to flesh out Nick and Kar Vastor. Obviously, he's reintroducing them since they first appeared in Shatterpoint. But again, there doesn't seem to be enough time for him to really give the audience the scoop on these two. Not through dialogue with any of the other characters or through any internal monologue on Nick's part. I say only Nick's because Kar Vastor mostly doesn't communicate through words, just animalistic growls. All we really learn about Nick is that he has a history of working with Jedi, presumably during the Clone Wars, and that he was actually acquainted with Anakin Skywalker, who, unlike his son, was not above killing when he thought it was necessary. In fact, Nick is kind of surprised by how soft-hearted Luke seems to be by comparison. As a result, Nick initially tries to conceal what he knows about Kar Vastor and that he is just another brainwashed puppet of Cronal, because he fears that if Luke knows that Vastor is just another of Black Hole's victims, he'll go soft on him and that might get him killed. And while Luke thinks his life is not worth more than others, Nick very much disagrees. And given that Luke is virtuous enough to help out two strangers like him and Aona, having never met them before, he might actually have the better argument. But of course, Jedi insight being what it is, Luke finds out anyway, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Back to communing with the Melters. Communing with the Melters brings Luke dangerously close to succumbing to that fragment of the dark that Cronal put in him when he was trying to take over his body. Luckily, that visual metaphor of Luke and the Melters as stars gives him the answer he needs to fight off the despair. And the answer is hearkening back to that old bit of Jedi wisdom, that the Force is an energy field that surrounds, penetrates, and binds all within the universe together. Individually, each life is like a tiny candle flame against the dark, but through the Force, all life is connected. And because the Force is part of them, as it is a part of all life, each individual, whether brightly or dimly, shines in defiance of the dark. They're not insignificant flames to be snuffed out, as Cronal thinks. Each is unique and beautiful and bright in its own way. Luke ends the communion with the Melters, because now he knows what to do about Black Hole. Back to the space battle, Lando and the New Republic fleet are very much fighting a losing battle. Even with Lando's redirecting the gravity gun's projectile ploy, they're still losing badly. They do have a good chance of taking the bad guys with them, but that's pretty much the most optimistic thing they can hope for. And then, General Luke Skywalker broadcasts on all frequencies, ordering the New Republic cruisers to land as close as they can to Shadow Base to receive civilian refugees, and he orders all Imperial forces to stand down and help with the evacuation. And amazingly, they obey his command. And with the help of the Melters forming a kind of airtight corridor between the Shadow Base and the New Republic cruisers, the remaining Imperial troops and Fen Shisa's Mandalorians are able to safely hustle the prisoners to safety. Now all that's left is to deal with Cronal and rescue Leia. Now, just to make sure that we're all on the same page here, Cronal is currently possessing the body of Car Vastor, as I said before, which by now is with Leia inside a giant bubble of melt massive called the Shadow Egg, because why not? And the old bastard is still busily trying to break Leia's will so that he can possess her. Meanwhile, Cronal's actual old man body is still plugged into its life support system and stuck inside a small pod that was ejected from Shadow Base as it began to lift off. It's basically an escape pod with lightspeed capabilities encased inside of an asteroid so that no one would notice it or think it's just another piece of debris from Shadow Base's takeoff. This way, even if everything goes to pot, Cronal can just return his consciousness to his original body and make a break for it. Luckily, thanks to his new connection with the Melters, Luke is able to bust into the Shadow Egg and confront Cronal/Vastor. Plus, if you recall, Nick Rostu still has that weird melt massive neural network in him like Luke does, and so he is connected to Cronal just as Luke is, only much more weakly. They all know what each other knows, and that means that Nick knows about Cronal's little bolt hole ship. And while Luke faces down Cronal in the body of Vastor, Nick and Aona are hoving in on Cronal's little getaway pod. And so Luke makes an ultimatum to the Rhandist sorcerer. Leave Leia, leave Vastor's body, and leave the Taspan system with his life. Unlike Luke, Nick has no compunctions against killing. And so if Cronal doesn't leave or take a new host before Nick finds him, he's almost certainly a dead man. And as a cherry on top, Luke's brought the Falcon and a group of stormtroopers that are now loyal to him as backup. Cronal does actually concede defeat here, realizing that there's just no winning solution for him. But like so many Star Wars bad guys, he's a spiteful bastard, and his defeat has one final sting in the proverbial tail. He does indeed abandon Car Vastor's body, restoring the giant savage to himself, but not before he lets Luke in on one little secret. You may have noticed up until this point that for some reason, all the stormtroopers working for Cronal have black armor instead of white. Turns out, that black armor is full of melt massive. The instant he's back in his own body, Cronal activates one final failsafe. Well, actually, two final failsafes. First, he activates a bunch of gravity projectors that he seeded the asteroid field with. Of course, in the Star Wars universe, being too close to a gravity well means you can't go to hyperspace. At least not without tearing your ship apart. His little life pod / asteroid has engines powerful enough to propel him into deep space. And since the asteroid's made of melt massive, he's safe from Taspan's energy flares. The New Republic ships are all stuck in the Taspan system, even as Mindor breaks apart beneath them, meaning that they can't escape to hyperspace and will eventually be consumed by the energy flares shooting out of the star. This means that Nick and Aona are thwarted in their efforts of trying to catch up to him as well. The second thing that he does is activate the melt massive inside his stormtroopers' armor, which basically pierces their brains and drives them into a killing frenzy. And pretty much everyone, from the ground troopers to the TIE pilots, just keep throwing themselves at the New Republic forces in suicidal frenzies. No tactics, no strategy, just kill as much as they can before they themselves are killed. Unsurprisingly, mass casualties ensue. It seems that Cronal has gotten away, and he is determined to one day come back and start over. He believes that he failed this time because he made the same mistake as Palpatine. His whole possession plan had been a plan of creation rather than destruction, and so the dark, ever fickle, abandoned him. Of course, he plans not to make the same mistake a second time. But it turns out he might not get that second time. Luke still has that melt-massive neural network in him, as does Carvastor. And as we've established, this neural network is a two-way street. Remember how when he was communing with the Melters, Luke imagined in his mind that they were all stars and Chronal was a great black hole sucking all the light in and consuming it? Well, Luke asks the former Sorcerer of Rhand, what is the opposite of a black hole? Well, there's this theory. I don't know if it's still plausible today, but it certainly was in the early 2000s. It was the idea that matter that goes into a black hole gets spat out into a whole other universe. Thus, as Luke believes, the opposite of a black hole is a fountain of light and energy. And so, using the melt-massive neural connections between him and Vastor and Chronal, Luke essentially injects the Force into Chronal via his Shadow Crown, this device that helps him boost his control of melt-massive, thus purging himself, Leia and Carvastor, and Chronal himself of every drop of melt-massive. The book literally describes it oozing out of Chronal's skin like a black oily liquid. But Luke doesn't stop there. Remember, the Melters are made of melt-massive, and essentially Chronal has been using them to power this whole operation of his, by exploiting their dependency on absorbing energy, the literal light of the stars themselves. But because the Shadow Crown that Chronal wears connects him to all melt-massive in the area, Luke is able to inject the light side of the Force into the Melters themselves. Now, they will no longer need to feed upon light, because the light now comes from within. And so, even as Chronal finally tries to flee into hyperspace, the melt-massive that creates the asteroid around his little escape ship melts away around him, taking the hyperdrive with it, thus leaving Chronal, aka Black Hole, aka Lord Shadowspawn, exposed to hyperspace. And so the former Sorcerer of Rhand literally feels his very atoms lose their cohesion, and he just disappears. Good news, since Chronal used the melt-massive, i.e. the Melters in just about everything, it means that the gravity projectors are now deactivated and the New Republic fleet can escape to hyperspace, thus saving themselves from Taspan's radiation. The bad news is that because of Chronal's love of dead man switches, by purging the melt-massive, Luke also ends up killing all of the Imperial stormtroopers. He knew that this is what would happen, and he feels really guilty about it. And so he does the only thing that feels right. He shares minds with the stormtroopers as they die, as he feels he owes it to them to be with them in their final moments of agony, and finally, release from that agony. Even without that, Luke and Vastor are still left stuck inside that shadow egg thing. After Chronal abandoned Vastor's body, Luke was able to get Leia, Han, Chewie, and the Falcon away before the melt-massive drove the stormtroopers berserk. But faithful R2, whose most important imperative is to protect Master Luke, actually left the Falcon via the garbage disposal just as it was taking off from the shadow egg thing. And now that the gravity projectors are down and no longer preventing ships from escaping to hyperspace, he's able to boost a signal that is picked up by Nick and Aona, who fly over to save Luke and Vastor. And so ends the Battle of Mindor. In the aftermath, Nick is still convinced that Chronal is somehow alive, and so he, Aona, and Carvastor go off in search of him. I did some digging, and there's this villain in a small comic that some kind of retcon later tries to claim is Chronal. Personally, I think that's just a load of bunk, and Stover just threw that in at the end in case he wanted to come back to this. As far as I'm concerned, dissolving into hyperspace is a pretty definitive death. It's not mentioned, but it is confirmed by later stories, that is, later in the Star Wars timeline, that shortly after Mindor, Lando resigns his officer's commission in the New Republic. And sheltering the New Republic fleet behind the bulk of Shadow Base from Taspan's radiation has given him an idea for a new business venture, a business venture that will eventually become Nomad City in the Thrawn trilogy. As for Luke, we come back to Mr. Gepton, the guy that Luke hired to essentially investigate himself for war crimes. Rather than indict Luke as the Jedi believes he deserves to be, Gepton instead wrote a script for a holo thriller and sold the rights to make a profit. He does make the point that yes, by purging the Melt Massif, Luke knowingly killed all those Imperials. On the other hand, what else could he have done? Arguably, those stormtroopers were dead the moment Cronal activated that little berserk failsafe. Luke's not happy about it, but he does reconcile himself to the fact that people are going to think whatever they think of him, regardless of the truth. He does resign his general's commission, though, as a consequence of Mindor, deciding that he didn't do very well as an officer and instead should dedicate all of his energies into rebuilding the Jedi Order in peace. Although, of course, we all know that's not going to happen because no matter who owns it, Lucasfilm, as it turns out, is the real final boss. And they would just keep coming up with new stories and new characters and new problems for the same heroes to deal with, to the point where the fandom was starting to get sick of it. Little did we know that we would soon be praying for those halcyon days, especially after 2017. Honestly, I have quite a few problems with Luke Skywalker and the Shadows of Mindor. I've already mentioned the fact that Stover really did try to cram too many characters and too many subplots into a single novel. The fact that Han and Leia's romance basically reverses its progress back to Empire Strikes Back times, while the smaller roles like Fen Shaisa or Stover's own creations like Nick and Kar Vastor are little more than glorified cameos. The one thing I will say that I really did enjoy about this story was Cronal, and especially the concept of the Sorcerers of Rhand and their perspective on the Force. While I don't quite fall into the camp that too much of Star Wars focuses on the Jedi, they are kind of the unique factor of this particular intellectual property, I do agree that an underdeveloped and underutilized aspect of Star Wars is the idea of different interpretations and utilizations of the Force. So I can always appreciate a Star Wars story that does go into that kind of uncharted territory. That said, I think that the biggest issue I have with Luke Skywalker and the Shadows of Mindor overall is the premise and how it's resolved. The story begins and ends with Luke insisting that he should be indicted for committing a heinous act. This is the obvious hook to draw in the reader. And if you're especially someone who's familiar with the Star Wars setting in any way, how could Luke Skywalker, paragon of virtue, do something that might be warranted as a war crime? In the end, though, the payoff is kind of a letdown, as Luke's killing of the Imperial stormtroopers by purging the Melt Massif looks less like a terrible but necessary act and more of a mercy kill. The book's description makes it clear the stormtroopers were driven insane by agony. And so the idea that Luke could expect some kind of serious condemnation for it comes off as more than a little unrealistic and even borderline absurd. Especially since as readers we have that third-person omniscient perspective on all that's going on in the story. Ironically, for all the dark and creepy stuff that Stover introduces into this story, like how the pawns are made, the whole premise of nihilistic Randist philosophy and the dark, Cronal's attempts to take over Luke's mind, or how the Melters abduct people by literally sucking them down into the ground. Ironically, when it comes to what is supposed to be the main premise of the story, he doesn't go hard enough. As a result, rather than Luke being racked with guilt over a terrible, tragic thing, he seems, if anything, far too hard on himself. Now, in fairness, this is perfectly in character for Luke Skywalker, but if you really wanted the reader to feel his mental anguish over what he had to do, you would have to, for lack of a better word, go someplace even darker than what you've got on offer here. It is kind of ridiculous that I keep doing canon verdicts at this point, given that apart from Rogue One, Disney hasn't produced a single decent Star Wars property, or at least one that it eventually hasn't screwed. But I've been doing this formula for years, and it's a little too late to change it up now. For me, because of a disappointing payoff for what was supposed to be a really intriguing setup, among all the other criticisms, I kinda have to give Luke Skywalker and the Shadows of Mindor the non-canon verdict. Let me know in the comments section if you agree or disagree. Make your arguments as detailed as possible because I love that sort of thing. And who knows, if it's a good enough case, you might actually get me to reverse my verdict, for whatever that's worth. Also, if you like, you can make suggestions for what I should put in the next poll for the next time I do Star Wars Should This Be Canon. Until then.